The city was quiet, but Harlem was alive. After midnight, the streets glowed with a mix of danger and beauty, a strange kind of electricity that could be felt in the air. Neon lights from corner bars and jazz clubs reflected off the slick pavement, where a light drizzle from earlier in the evening left the roads shining like glass. In the distance, the sound of a lone saxophone spilled out of a club's open door, soft and smoky, blending with the hum of traffic and the occasional shout from a passing group of night owls. Harlem in the 1970s had its own rhythm, a heartbeat that never seemed to slow down, even when the rest of the city slept. This was a neighborhood full of contradictions. By day, Harlem bustled with children playing on stoops, street vendors selling newspapers, and people hurrying to catch buses to jobs downtown. But by night, the neighborhood transformed into something else entirely, half stage and half battlefield. The music was louder, the shadows deeper, and the money quicker. It was in this very world that one man's name would rise above the rest, spoken in whispers, feared by many, and respected by even more. His name was Leroy Nicky Barnes, but on these streets, people simply called him Mr. Untouchable. Imagine walking through those streets, the faint smell of fried food and cigarette smoke drifting in the air, passing groups of young hustlers leaning against lampposts, their eyes scanning every car that rolled by. Somewhere in that crowd, Nicky Barnes might have been watching too, not just the street, but the entire game unfolding around him. Harlem was his stage, and every night was another move in the life he was building. The world knew him as a crime figure, a drug kingpin who became the face of Harlem's heroin trade, but to understand how he got there, you have to step into the Harlem of his time, a place both unforgiving and full of opportunity for a man with vision. There is a reason his story still fascinates people today. It is a story of ambition, discipline, and transformation, but also one of betrayal, tragedy, and a lesson in the cost of power. At its peak, Nicky's empire was run with the precision of a corporation, distributing heroin across Harlem with such efficiency that law enforcement considered him one of the most organized and dangerous drug lords in America. But he was more than a name on a police file. He was a man who cultivated an image of style and control, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits, always composed, always appearing one step ahead of everyone trying to catch him. The newspapers called him Mr. Untouchable, and for years, that title seemed true. He was arrested, investigated, wiretapped, and followed, but nothing seemed to stick. Every time prosecutors tried to bring him down, the cases fell apart. Witnesses disappeared, evidence went missing, and juries failed to convict. For Harlem, he became almost mythic, part villain, part folk hero, a man who beat the system and lived life on his own terms. People admired his discipline. He didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and insisted that his organization operated under strict rules to keep violence to a minimum. In a world that was chaotic, Nicky was a man who seemed to impose order. But there was always another side to the story. The heroin he distributed destroyed lives. Families were torn apart, entire blocks consumed by addiction, and Harlem's vibrant culture was overshadowed by the epidemic. And even though Nicky believed he ran things with control, the underworld has its own rules, and no one can stay untouchable forever. There were cracks forming in his empire, cracks that no amount of money, discipline, or suits could hide. The streets have a way of taking back what they give, and Nicky's story would eventually become a lesson in how power can turn on those who hold it. Still, to truly understand who he was, we have to go back to where it all started, before the fame, before the power, before the headlines. We have to go back to the boy from Harlem who learned early on that the system was not built for him and that if he wanted a place in the world, he would have to carve it out himself. The man who would one day be called Mr. Untouchable was once just Leroy, a kid running through crowded streets, watching, listening, learning, and dreaming of something bigger than the life he was born into. What makes this story so compelling is not just the rise, but the journey itself. Every choice Nicky made, every lesson he learned, shaped the man he became. His story is not just about crime, it is about ambition, discipline, loyalty, betrayal, and the price of success in a world where the line between survival and destruction was razor thin. Tonight, We will follow his journey step by step, from those early Harlem nights to the courtroom where his legend was tested, to the quiet places where he spent his final years far away from the streets that made him. And as we begin, it's worth pausing for a moment and picturing him as he must have been in those days at the height of his power, riding through Harlem in a shiny car, the music of the city around him, every eye on the block following him as he passed. People whispered his name with a mix of fear and admiration. He was a symbol of what was possible if you were bold enough, disciplined enough, and ruthless enough to take it. But what happens when a man who built an empire decides he can never be caught? What happens when he believes he really is untouchable? The answer to that question will unfold as we step deeper into the story, a story where power and downfall are never far apart, and where the man who once ruled Harlem would one day have to face the cost of everything he created. Before the name, Mr. Untouchable, ever appeared in headlines, there was simply Leroy. Born in 1933, he entered the world in a Harlem that was vibrant but harsh, a neighborhood filled with music, hope, and struggle all at once. The Great Depression had left its scars, and Harlem, though rich in culture, was also rich in poverty. Families lived in crowded tenements where the walls seemed to breathe with every argument, every laugh, every dream. The smell of coal smoke and cheap cooking oil clung to the air, and the streets outside were alive with kids playing stickball, the rattle of trolley cars, and the chatter of neighbors leaning from open windows. Leroy's family was working class, like most around them. His parents did what they could to keep food on the table, but money was always tight. Harlem in those years was a place where survival required creativity, where hustlers sold anything from bootleg liquor to second-hand clothes just to get by. Leroy was observant, curious, and sharp. Even as a boy, he noticed who had money and who didn't, who commanded respect and who got pushed aside. Respect was currency in Harlem, and the men who seemed to have it all were the ones on the corners, dressed sharp, walking with confidence, speaking in low voices that made everyone listen. School was there, of course, but Harlem's streets were their own kind of classroom. Leroy absorbed lessons you couldn't find in books: how to read people, how to avoid trouble, and how to stay 2 steps ahead. He saw the pull of fast money everywhere. A man could make more in a single night running numbers or selling goods than he could working all week at a factory. It was tempting, especially when he saw his mother counting coins at the kitchen table, deciding which bills to pay first. In that environment, the idea of taking a shortcut didn't feel like rebellion, it felt like survival. But Harlem wasn't just grit, it was beauty, too. The 1930s and 1940s were still part of Harlem's cultural glow, where music was everywhere, where you could hear Billie Holiday sing or catch a band at the Apollo. There was pride in the neighborhood, a sense that this was the capital of Black America. Leroy grew up in a world where people were dreaming of a better life, but he also grew up in a world that reminded him, every day, of how hard that dream was to reach if you played by the rules. The police were not trusted, the opportunities were limited, and the streets offered their own version of justice. By the time Leroy was a teenager, he had started to test the boundaries. He wasn't reckless, at least, not compared to others, but he had a taste for risk. He dabbled in small hustles, running errands, helping older boys with schemes. He learned quickly that a good hustle wasn't just about strength or muscle, it was about discipline, timing, and knowing when to stay quiet. These were lessons he carried for life. Even then, Leroy had a presence about him, a quiet confidence that made people pay attention. He dressed neatly, carried himself well, and had a sense of dignity that set him apart. But dignity didn't keep trouble away. Like many kids his age, he had run-ins with the law. His first arrest came young, too young, and though it was minor, it left a mark. Jail, even for a short time, was terrifying, but it was also eye-opening. He saw older men, hardened by years inside, who carried themselves like they had the answers to questions he didn't even know how to ask yet. The experience could have scared him straight, but for Leroy, it only confirmed what he already suspected: the system wasn't designed to protect him, so he would have to learn how to beat it. At home, there were attempts to steer him right. Teachers saw his intelligence and tried to keep him focused. There were relatives who warned him that the streets would chew him up. But Harlem had a way of shaping its own. The pull of the outside world was stronger than lectures. The streets had money, excitement, and respect, and for a boy who had felt powerless, that kind of respect was magnetic. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, Leroy's world was changing. The neighborhood was becoming rougher, the drug trade was creeping in, and violence was starting to rise. The hustlers he had once admired were getting richer, but they were also getting more dangerous. Leroy watched carefully, learning not just from their successes but also from their mistakes. Every time someone got arrested, he took mental notes. Every time someone got robbed or betrayed, he filed it away. It was in these formative years that Leroy began to understand the concept of control. If you wanted to survive, you couldn't just react, you had to plan. You had to stay cool under pressure, keep your word when it mattered, and never let emotions rule your decisions. These were the seeds of the man he would become, the man who would one day run Harlem's heroin trade like a CEO. Yet there was still innocence left in him, moments of laughter with friends, dances on summer nights, the joy of a neighborhood block party where music poured out of every window. Harlem was hard, but it was also alive, and Leroy was a part of that life. He was watching, learning, preparing, though he didn't know yet for what. The boy was becoming the man, and the choices he was about to make would lead him down a road with no way back. What's striking about Leroy's early years is how ordinary they were in so many ways. He was not born into crime. He was not destined to be a kingpin. He was a boy from Harlem, living in a world that offered him two paths: follow the rules and stay broke, or bend the rules and take a chance. The choice he made would change not just his own life, but the lives of thousands of people around him. And soon, that choice would put him face to face with men who would become his greatest teachers, inside a place that would become the real turning point of his life, prison. By the time Leroy was edging into adulthood, the lessons of Harlem had become second nature. The streets were his classroom, and he had graduated from small errands to more daring moves. The quick money that had once seemed out of reach was now within his grasp. Petty hustles turned into small thefts, and small thefts grew into bolder schemes. Leroy was careful, but he was not invisible. No one could be invisible forever in Harlem. Eyes were always watching: cops, hustlers, neighbors, rivals. His first real brush with the law came during one of these early hustles. It was nothing elaborate, just a simple theft, something that should have gone unnoticed, but Leroy got caught. The arrest was humiliating. Handcuffed, walked past curious neighbors, he felt a sting that went beyond fear. It was pride. For someone who carried himself with such dignity, being paraded like that through his own streets burned in his memory. And yet, the experience didn't scare him off. If anything, it hardened him. If he was going to risk everything, he might as well make the risk worth it. The young Leroy quickly learned that Harlem's underworld was a place where respect was earned by being smart, not just strong. Anyone could throw a punch or pull a knife, but not everyone could think 2 steps ahead. Leroy had a knack for staying calm under pressure. Even in confrontations, his voice stayed level, his expression unreadable. That composure impressed the older hustlers who watched him. They saw someone who might be worth teaching, someone who could be shaped. But before those lessons came, there were more mistakes. Leroy's early years were marked by a cycle of hustling, getting caught, and landing in and out of jail for short stints. Jail, to a young man, was supposed to be a warning, a way to scare someone back onto the straight path. For Leroy, it became something else entirely. It became a place of observation, a place where he studied the men around him like a scientist studying a new species. Inside those walls, he met seasoned criminals, men who carried themselves like generals, even behind bars. They had codes, routines, discipline. Some of them were intellectuals in their own way, reading books on law and psychology, discussing strategies as if they were running companies rather than criminal enterprises. Leroy, ever the student, paid attention. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing their words, their attitudes, their rules. He learned that there was a difference between reckless crime and organized crime. Reckless crime was what got you killed or locked up for life with nothing to show for it. Organized crime was about control, about planning, about turning chaos into profit. These lessons were gold to a young man who had always valued discipline. Jail was supposed to break him, but instead it was sharpening him like a blade. Outside, Harlem was changing fast. The drug trade was spreading like wildfire, heroin in particular. It was making some men rich beyond imagination and leaving others dead on the sidewalks. Leroy began to see the drug game not as chaos, but as an opportunity, a system that could be controlled if the right person had the right mind to run it. He also saw the dangers, the addicts, the overdoses, the killings. But in the cold calculus of the street, those dangers were part of the price. When Leroy got out of jail, he was no longer the same young man. The boyish edges had been stripped away. He walked differently now, spoke differently, carried himself with the confidence of someone who had looked into the system's machinery and figured out how to work around it. He was ready to climb higher. This was the period when he started associating with more serious players, men who had connections beyond Harlem, men who could get drugs into the city and needed disciplined distributors to move them. What set Leroy apart was not just his ambition but his ability to stay disciplined when others lost control. He didn't use the drugs he sold, which kept his mind clear. He didn't waste money recklessly. He reinvested, saved, and thought ahead. This mindset earned him respect, and respect opened doors. Soon, he was no longer just a small-time hustler trying to get by. He was building a reputation as someone who could be trusted to handle business, someone who wouldn't crack under pressure. But that same reputation also painted a target on his back. The police were beginning to take notice. Every arrest, every charge, was added to a file with his name on it. Detectives who worked Harlem began to recognize him on sight. They saw a young man with potential for real trouble and kept tabs on him. Each time they tried to put him away, he found a way to slip through, sometimes on legal technicalities, sometimes because witnesses wouldn't testify. The legend of Leroy Barnes was starting to grow, even if he didn't yet realize it. Still, the risk of the streets never went away. A wrong deal, a wrong word, a wrong move could mean a bullet. Leroy knew this, which is why he began to think even more carefully about his future. The hustlers who survived were not the loudest or the flashiest, they were the ones who built something stable, something that could outlast a police raid or a betrayal. Leroy was thinking bigger now, imagining not just making money but running an operation that was bigger than one man. It was this drive, this hunger, that would eventually lead him back to prison, but this time it wouldn't be a short stay. It would be a long sentence, the kind of sentence that might have crushed someone else but would instead turn him into the man Harlem would one day know as Mr. Untouchable. Prison was waiting for him again, and this time, it wouldn't just be punishment, it would be transformation. And so, the young man who had once been just another face on the block was about to step into a place that would shape him forever. Behind those walls, he would meet the men who would teach him not just how to survive, but how to rule. Prison has a way of stripping a man bare. The noise, the smell of disinfectant mixed with sweat, the clang of metal doors, these things break some people. But for Leroy Barnes, prison became something else entirely. It became a kind of school, a place where he would discover not just who he was, but who he could become. The young hustler who walked through those gates might have been bitter, angry, and restless, but he would walk out of them years later with a new identity and a new mission. The first nights inside were the hardest. The sound of the locks clicking shut at lights out was a constant reminder that he was no longer free, no longer in control. The air was heavy with tension. Fights could break out without warning. Men shouted down the tier, some crying, some laughing, some whispering threats. Leroy kept his head down at first, observing, measuring the rhythm of prison life. He was smart enough to know that showing fear was dangerous, but so was acting too tough. He chose to be quiet, calculating, patient. And then something unexpected happened. He found mentors, men who recognized something in him, perhaps the same calm, disciplined presence that had set him apart on the streets. These were not reckless corner hustlers, they were thinkers, men with decades of experience in organized crime. They taught him that prison didn't have to be wasted time. They taught him that a man could use those years to prepare for the future. Some of them were old-timers from the mafia, some were black underworld figures with long reputations, and all of them had something valuable to teach. Leroy began to read. Not just casual reading, he devoured books. Law books, in particular, fascinated him. He wanted to know how the system worked, how cases were built, how cases were beaten. In the prison library, he pored over criminal law texts, memorizing procedures, learning the technicalities that could get evidence thrown out or charges reduced. The more he learned, the more he realized that beating the system wasn't just luck. It was strategy. It was preparation. It was discipline. But the education went beyond books. Prison was filled with politics, alliances, rivalries, unspoken codes, and Leroy studied that, too. He saw which men had influence, which ones were respected, which ones were feared. He noticed that power inside prison wasn't about who shouted the loudest but about who could keep things under control. The men who commanded real authority were the ones who could solve problems, keep the peace when needed, or make a problem disappear when words no longer worked. Leroy took mental notes, watching how they negotiated, how they made decisions, how they handled betrayal. Day by day, prison reshaped him. The young man who had once been quick to take a risk became more patient, more methodical. He developed routines, worked out his body to stay strong, kept his mind sharp with reading and conversation. The chaos of prison life was always around him, but he refused to let it consume him. He treated prison as if it were a training ground, preparing for a future that no one else could see but him. He also began to cultivate relationships that would prove invaluable later. These were men who had connections on the outside, men who had access to suppliers, distributors, and networks that stretched beyond Harlem. Conversations that started in the yard or over a shared meal became the foundation of something larger. Leroy was no longer thinking about hustling for himself. He was thinking about building something organized, something disciplined, something that could last. There were moments of danger, of course. Prison was never safe, and Leroy had to prove himself more than once. But he did it carefully, never recklessly. If there was a fight, it was because it was unavoidable, and even then, he made sure it was quick and decisive. He understood that survival inside was as much about perception as it was about strength. If people saw that he could handle himself but wasn't out looking for trouble, they would leave him alone, or even better, they would respect him. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. By the time his release date approached, Leroy was no longer just another Harlem hustler. He had become sharper, more focused, more disciplined. He had learned that success was not about acting out of emotion but about staying in control, about planning 3 moves ahead. The lessons of prison were now part of him, and he intended to use them. When the day finally came for him to walk free, Leroy felt something he hadn't felt before: clarity. He had a plan. He wasn't going back to petty hustles and short-term schemes. He was going to build something bigger, something better. The men he had met, the connections he had made, the knowledge he had gained, all of it would come together. Harlem would never see him the same way again. He wasn't just Leroy anymore. The seeds of Mr. Untouchable had been planted, and they were about to grow. As he stepped back onto the streets, the air of Harlem felt different. The sounds, the faces, the energy, it was all familiar, but Leroy saw it with new eyes. He could see the opportunities everywhere, the chaos that needed organizing, the money waiting to be made by someone disciplined enough to take it. He was ready to become that someone. The boy had become the student, and now the student was ready to become the master. But the streets were not empty, and Harlem had changed in his absence. New players had risen, new dangers had appeared, and the drug trade had become even more profitable, and even more violent. Leroy was about to step into a game that was bigger than anything he had played before. The question was no longer whether he could survive the streets. The question was whether he could control them. When Leroy walked out of prison, the air felt different, not just because he was free, but because he was different. The streets that had once seemed chaotic now looked like a chessboard, every corner and every player a piece that could be moved. Harlem hadn't slowed down while he was away, if anything, it had gotten wilder. The drug trade was no longer just a side hustle for a few brave dealers, it had exploded into a booming market, with heroin at its center. It was profitable, dangerous, and poorly organized. To Leroy, fresh out of prison and armed with discipline, it looked like opportunity waiting to be shaped. His first steps back were cautious. He didn't rush into anything reckless. He spent time just walking the streets, reconnecting with old faces, and getting a feel for the new order of things. Harlem was buzzing. The music was louder, the cars flashier, the hustlers bolder. There were new crews running corners, some sloppy, some ruthless. Leroy studied them quietly, learning who was in charge, who could be trusted, and who was likely to self-destruct. The man who had gone into prison had been just another ambitious hustler. The man who came out had patience. And patience was a rare commodity on the streets. He knew that if he wanted to rise, he couldn't just be another loud, flashy dealer. He had to be smarter. He had to run things like a business. He had to build something that could outlast police raids, rival crews, and even betrayal. One of the first things he did was reconnect with contacts he had made inside. The men he had spoken with in prison were more than just mentors, they were potential partners. Some had connections to suppliers, others to distributors. Leroy positioned himself carefully, offering reliability where others offered chaos. He didn't just want to make money, he wanted to make sure everyone involved made money, because money built loyalty, and loyalty kept people quiet. His approach began to get noticed. While other dealers were spending every dollar they made on cars and clothes, Leroy reinvested. He kept his operation lean and efficient, cutting out unnecessary risks. If someone was too unpredictable, they were out. If someone was too loud, they were replaced. His reputation grew not because he was feared, but because he was respected. People started to see that working with him meant getting paid on time, staying safe, and avoiding unnecessary heat from the police. But Harlem's streets were never just business. There was always tension, always the threat of violence. Leroy had to prove that his calm exterior wasn't weakness. When challenges came, and they always did, he handled them decisively. If someone crossed him, there were consequences, but those consequences were measured. He didn't believe in reckless bloodshed, it attracted too much attention. Instead, he believed in sending clear messages that restored order without creating chaos. That balance made him stand out. It was during this time that Leroy began to shed the last traces of his old identity. He was becoming something bigger than just a hustler, he was becoming a leader. The neighborhood began to notice. People started to talk about him with a kind of cautious respect. He was seen in sharp suits now, moving with confidence, his posture straight, his expression calm. If he was at a bar or a club, he didn't blend into the background anymore. People gravitated toward him, drawn by the aura he carried. He also started to think beyond himself. The heroin trade was making money, but it was chaotic. There were too many small crews, too many unnecessary fights, too much wasted potential. Leroy began to imagine a system, a council, a network that could bring order to the madness. If the trade could be organized, everyone could make more money, and the violence could be kept under control. It was an idea that sounded impossible to some, but to Leroy, it was not just possible, it was necessary. Harlem was ready for a man like him, and Leroy was ready for Harlem. His transformation was nearly complete. The man who had once been just another kid running from the cops was now moving towards something much bigger, something that would make him a household name. Soon, he wouldn't just be part of the game, he would control it. But control always comes with a price. And as Leroy began to rise, so did the dangers. Rivals were watching. The police were watching. Even allies sometimes watched too closely, wondering if he was getting too big, too fast. It was a dangerous balance to strike, but Leroy thrived on that tension. He kept his focus, kept his composure, and kept moving forward, one step at a time. What he didn't know yet was that his vision would soon become reality, that he would soon gather some of Harlem's most powerful dealers together to form an alliance unlike anything the city had seen before. An alliance that would bring money, power, and, for a time, order to the streets. It would also make him a target like never before. For now, though, Leroy was calm. He was deliberate. He was watching the board, planning his next move, preparing to take Harlem by storm. The streets didn't know it yet, but the man who would soon be called Mr. Untouchable was already setting his empire in motion. It began with quiet conversations in back rooms and smoky lounges, whispered meetings in the corners of Harlem's most trusted bars, and phone calls placed only from payphones far from home. Leroy Barnes, now a man of calculated presence, had been watching, waiting, and preparing. He saw what others didn't. The heroin trade was powerful, but it was chaotic. Crews fought over corners, violence spilled onto the streets, and the police were growing bolder with every raid. If the business was going to survive, it needed rules. It needed structure. It needed leadership. So Leroy started building. He didn't make a public announcement. He didn't shout about it on the streets. Instead, he began handpicking the right men, dealers with respect, with networks, and with discipline, the kind of men who could follow a code. He knew that a single man could never control Harlem's heroin trade alone. But a council, a small and secretive syndicate of trusted leaders. That was different. That was power. He called them together one by one. The meetings were quiet, private. Leroy explained his vision, a cooperative that would pool resources, share information, and divide territory in a way that reduced unnecessary conflict. If one man had a good supplier, they would all benefit. If one man got heat from the police, the others would help him lay low until it passed. It was, in many ways, a business meeting, but a business meeting where millions of dollars, and lives, were on the table. The men he chose were some of the most powerful players in Harlem. They each controlled their own distribution, had their own crews, their own corners. But they all saw the same thing Leroy saw: without structure, the chaos would eventually destroy them all. With structure, they could all get rich and keep the police guessing. This group became known simply as the Council. It was small, never more than 7 men, and each had an equal say. Decisions were made collectively. Disputes were settled behind closed doors, not on the streets where blood could bring police attention. And at the center of it all was Leroy Barnes, whose discipline and charisma made him the natural leader. But the council was more than just a group of drug dealers. It was, in many ways, a corporation. Leroy insisted on rules, strict rules, that everyone had to follow. No one was allowed to use heroin themselves. It clouded judgment and led to mistakes. Violence was only to be used when absolutely necessary. Profits were to be shared fairly. Every man was expected to keep a low profile, to avoid the kind of flashy behavior that attracted unwanted attention. Leroy also brought in systems to ensure quality control. He wanted the product they sold to be consistent, pure enough to keep customers coming back but cut enough to maximize profit. He even instituted standardized packaging so that Harlem addicts could recognize their brand, a marketing move as clever as anything a legitimate business might have done. Money began to flow like never before. Millions of dollars moved through the council's hands, week after week. Leroy took his share, of course, but he also reinvested, making sure that stash houses were secure, couriers were paid, and lawyers were always ready. He thought of everything, and it showed. Arrests were rare. Raids turned up nothing. Witnesses vanished or kept their mouths shut. For a while, it seemed as though the nickname, Mr. Untouchable, wasn't just a clever phrase, it was the truth. Harlem noticed. The streets grew calmer. Violence dipped. The dealers who had once fought bitterly for corners were now working together, their crews coordinated. Their operations smooth. Even the police noticed the strange order that had settled over the neighborhood. It was as though an invisible hand had smoothed out the chaos. But behind closed doors, the meetings of the council were anything but casual. They were intense, deliberate affairs where every decision was weighed carefully. Leroy ran them like a boardroom executive, sometimes even wearing a suit to underscore the seriousness of the business at hand. Each man's opinion was heard, but in the end, it was Leroy's presence, calm, commanding, that guided the direction of the group. As money poured in, Leroy's own image began to evolve. He was no longer just a respected hustler, he was Harlem's kingpin, though he would never have called himself that. He was building something larger than himself, something that could, he believed, outlive him. Yet, even in these early days of the council, Leroy understood the risk. The higher you rise, the more people notice. Rivals outside of the council watched with envy, wondering how long they would be allowed to operate independently. Law enforcement, though often frustrated, never stopped watching. And of course, there was always the risk of betrayal from within, a risk Leroy tried to minimize with loyalty and discipline, but one that could never fully be eliminated. Still, for now, it was working. The council was thriving, the money was flowing, and Leroy Barnes was becoming something larger than life. The streets had a new order, one that was almost elegant in its efficiency. But power is intoxicating, and power attracts attention. Newspapers were starting to hear rumors of a new force controlling Harlem. Reporters began sniffing around, piecing together the story of a man who seemed untouchable. Soon, the name Leroy Nicky Barnes would no longer just be whispered on the corners, it would appear in print, in headlines that made him a celebrity and a target at the same time. For now, though, Leroy was exactly where he wanted to be, in control, respected, and on the verge of becoming something Harlem had never seen before, a gangster with the discipline of a CEO and the untouchability of a myth. By the mid-1970s, Leroy Nicky Barnes was no longer just a name in Harlem, he was the name. The council had transformed the heroin trade into a well-oiled machine, money flowed with mathematical precision, and the streets whispered about him with a mix of reverence and fear. Harlem was not just under his influence, it was his empire. And like any empire, it had a king. Everywhere Nicky went, his presence was felt. He was never sloppy, never careless. He dressed in custom-tailored suits, Italian shoes, and silk ties, projecting the image of a man who was untouchable, invincible. His appearance alone sent a message, he was not just another street hustler. He was a businessman, a leader, someone who saw himself on a level above the chaos of the corner. The council's rules were working. Violence stayed under control. Money was collected on time. Crews operated with discipline. But Nicky's rise wasn't just about discipline, it was also about style. He had a natural charisma that drew people in. When he walked into a club, heads turned. When he spoke, people listened. There was a magnetism about him, a quiet confidence that made even rivals think twice before crossing him. And then came the moment that would make him a legend, the cover of the New York Times magazine. It was a bold move, almost reckless by Underworld standards. The Times published a long, detailed feature about Nicky Barnes, complete with a photo of him, arms crossed, staring into the camera with defiance and a grin. The headline was unforgettable, Mr. Untouchable. The article described him as the most powerful drug dealer in Harlem, a man the authorities had been trying, and failing, to convict for years. It painted him as a symbol of law enforcement's frustration, someone who had turned the game into an art form. The piece was part profile, part warning shot. And it had an effect that no police operation ever could. The public was fascinated. Overnight, Nicky Barnes went from being a name known mostly in Harlem and the DEA's files to a national figure. People outside of New York read the article and were captivated by this man who had, for years, evaded justice. The nickname, Mr. Untouchable, stuck, and in some ways, Nicky leaned into it. He had always been careful to control his image, but now his image had been broadcast to the world. For Harlem, the cover story was proof that their man had made it to the top. Some admired him for it, seeing him as someone who had beaten a system that had kept so many down. Others resented him, blaming him for the heroin epidemic ravaging their neighborhoods. But either way, his legend grew. At the height of his power, Nicky was making millions. His operation moved heroin in volumes that stunned federal agents. The money bought more than just clothes and cars, it bought lawyers, lookouts, and a network of protection that made him seem, for a time, invincible. His lifestyle became the stuff of urban folklore. Nicky threw lavish parties where the music was loud, the food endless, and the liquor flowing. He was known to be generous, giving gifts, helping out friends and family, spreading his wealth through Harlem. People said he could walk into any room and command it without raising his voice. And yet, with all this power, he remained disciplined. He still didn't use heroin himself. He didn't let his crew get sloppy. He kept records, tracked profits, and ran his operation like a Fortune 500 company. This was the paradox of Nicky Barnes, a man who was at once a criminal and a perfectionist, a lawbreaker who understood the law better than most lawyers. But the attention came with a cost. Law enforcement was now more determined than ever to bring him down. The DEA, the NYPD, the FBI, they all focused their resources on him. Wiretaps were placed, surveillance teams followed him day and night, and informants were pressured to talk. Nicky, ever confident, seemed unfazed. If anything, the pressure made him sharper. He changed meeting spots constantly, communicated in codes, and never let himself be cornered. His confidence, however, was turning into something else, something more dangerous. Being called Mr. Untouchable had a psychological effect. Nicky began to believe it. He had beaten the system so many times before that it seemed impossible that they could ever touch him. To him, the courts were just another arena to win in, the cops just another obstacle to outsmart. Each case that fell apart only reinforced the myth. But myths have a way of tempting fate. The higher you climb, the further you have to fall. And as Nicky sat at the top of Harlem's Underworld, smiling on the cover of the New York Times magazine, the men who wanted to bring him down were quietly tightening the net around him. For now, though, Nicky was untouchable. He was the king of Harlem, a man who had built an empire out of nothing, disciplined enough to keep it running like a machine. The streets were quieter, the money was flowing, and every move he made seemed to confirm that he was exactly what the papers said he was. But power is a dangerous thing, and attention is a double-edged sword. The same fame that made him a legend also made him a bigger target than ever before. And somewhere, in a federal office, a group of agents was looking at that New York Times cover and making a silent vow: one day, they would prove that Mr. Untouchable could, in fact, be touched. At the height of his reign, Nicky Barnes seemed to live in two worlds at once. To the public, he was Mr. Untouchable, the man who could not be caught, the kingpin who stared down the law with a grin. To Harlem, he was both a benefactor and a curse, the man whose network kept the streets running smoothly but whose product was destroying lives. And to himself, Nicky was a man in complete control, orchestrating an empire that stretched across the city, his influence reaching from corner boys to international suppliers. But with power came something else, something harder to see from the outside, a creeping sense of danger. The more successful he became, the more careful he had to be. He lived in luxury now, fine clothes, fast cars, a beautiful home, but his life was also carefully managed, almost ritualistic. Every meeting was planned, every movement calculated. He didn't just show up at a club, he arrived at exactly the right time, with exactly the right people, in exactly the right car. His image was as important as his business, and he never allowed either to slip. Nicky's discipline extended to his personal habits. He didn't drink excessively. He didn't use heroin. He believed that losing control of one's mind was the fastest way to lose everything. His mornings were structured, his meetings efficient, his evenings carefully curated. The people around him had to follow the same rules. If they didn't, they were out. Still, beneath the polished surface, tension was building. The cover story in the New York Times had made him famous, but it had also made him a bigger target than ever. Law enforcement attention was no longer limited to a few local detectives. Now the federal government was fully invested in bringing him down. The DEA expanded its task force. Wiretaps multiplied. Informants were flipped. And everywhere Nicky went, he had the sense, whether real or imagined, that someone was watching. He became more careful, but he also became more suspicious. He changed phone numbers often, refused to speak about business over unsecured lines, and started using coded language for even the smallest matters. Meetings were moved from one location to another at the last minute, just in case. He rotated stash houses, kept his network compartmentalized, and made sure that no one person knew too much. But paranoia has a way of eating at a man, even a man as disciplined as Nicky. Friends were no longer just friends, they were potential informants. Associates were potential traitors. Even the council, the very group he had built to bring order to Harlem, became a source of worry. Was everyone still loyal? Were they following the rules? Or were some of them getting sloppy, taking risks, threatening the delicate balance he had created? His nights grew longer. He still went to clubs, still made appearances, but his eyes were always scanning the room, looking for danger. He began to carry himself with even more caution, his composure still perfect but now edged with something harder, something colder. People who had once found him magnetic sometimes found him intimidating now, as if the weight of his empire had added an invisible distance between him and everyone else. And the empire was indeed heavy. Money was coming in faster than ever, but money brought problems. It had to be counted, laundered, hidden. Crews had to be paid. Suppliers had to be kept happy. And all of this had to be done while staying one step ahead of the law. Nicky's solution was to double down on discipline. He expected his lieutenants to run their operations with the same precision he demanded of himself. He monitored their performance, questioned their decisions, and kept detailed track of the flow of product and cash. If someone came up short, there were consequences. If someone drew unnecessary attention, they were replaced. But no amount of discipline could completely silence the unease building inside him. He could feel the noose tightening. The police were getting closer. Raids were becoming more frequent. Some of his men were getting nervous. And nervous men made mistakes. He also couldn't ignore the violence that, despite his rules, still flared up from time to time. Harlem was never completely peaceful. There were robberies, shootings, vendettas that even the council couldn't prevent. Each outbreak of violence was a risk, a chance for the police to swoop in, a chance for rivals to strike, a chance for someone to flip and talk. The very thing that had made him famous, his untouchable image, now made him restless. Every headline about him, every whisper on the street, every mention of his name felt like another spotlight on his back. Fame, he realized, was a double-edged sword. It brought power, yes, but it also brought scrutiny. Still, he did not falter. If anything, he grew sharper, colder, more determined. He was not about to let everything he had built crumble. To the outside world, Nicky Barnes remained composed, stylish, and confident. Inside, however, he was preparing for war, a war he knew was coming, though he didn't yet know when or from where. There were nights when he must have stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his suit jacket, staring at his own reflection and seeing not just a man but a symbol of victory over a system that had once tried to crush him. And yet, somewhere in that reflection, he must also have seen the truth, that every empire eventually faces its reckoning. For now, though, he continued to play the role perfectly. Harlem still whispered his name with awe. The money still flowed. The council still met in secret, still ran the business with precision. And Mr. Untouchable still walked the streets like a man who believed that nothing, not the police, not the government, not even fate, could ever bring him down. But the walls were closing in, slowly, quietly, in ways even Nicky could not completely control. And soon, that calm, carefully built world would face the one thing it had been designed to prevent: collapse. For all the discipline, all the structure, and all the order Nicky Barnes had built, the truth of his empire was never far from view. Harlem's streets still told the real story, and it was darker than the polished suits and smooth meetings behind closed doors. Heroin had become the lifeblood of his business, but it was also draining the life from the community he came from. It was a contradiction that even Nicky, with all his control, couldn't ignore. The evidence was everywhere. Walk a few blocks from one of the council's stash houses and you would see the result: addicts leaning against brick walls, eyes half closed, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the drug. On cold mornings, they gathered around trashcan fires, trading stories, waiting for the next fix. In stairwells and alleyways, needles littered the ground like fallen leaves. Harlem, once vibrant and proud, was now fighting a silent war with addiction, a war fueled by the very product that kept Nicky's pockets full. Nicky prided himself on running a clean operation, but there was nothing clean about what heroin did to people. Families were unraveling. Children were growing up without parents, either because their mothers and fathers were lost to addiction or because they were locked away on drug charges. Crime, though somewhat controlled by the council's rules, was still ever present. Muggings, robberies, and desperate break-ins followed wherever heroin went. The paradox weighed heavily on Harlem's conscience. Some people saw Nicky as a necessary evil, someone who had brought at least some order to the chaos. Others cursed his name, blaming him for turning their neighborhood into a place where despair could be bought for a few dollars a bag. Ministers preached against him from church pulpits. Community activists demanded police crackdowns. Mothers who had buried their sons pointed to men like Nicky as the reason why their homes were empty. And yet, for every voice that condemned him, there were others who admired him. To some, he was proof that a black man from Harlem could rise to a position of power, outthink the authorities, and live life on his own terms. His sharp suits, his control, his refusal to bow, all of it became part of his legend. That legend blinded many to the damage his empire was doing. Inside the council, tension was beginning to rise. The rules were still in place, but not everyone was following them as carefully as Nicky demanded. Some members were getting reckless, flashing too much money, drawing too much attention. Others were cutting corners, diluting product too heavily, or making side deals behind the group's back. For a man like Nicky, who built everything on trust and discipline, these cracks were dangerous, not just to the business, but to his own sense of control. And then there was the violence. For years, the council had managed to keep bloodshed to a minimum. But as profits grew, so did envy. Rival crews that had been pushed aside began to plot ways back in. Street-level disputes turned deadly. Bodies began to appear, some the result of council enforcement, others the work of outsiders trying to muscle in. Each killing risked bringing the police closer, and each time Nicky heard about another shooting, he felt the invisible clock ticking faster. Law enforcement was already circling. The DEA had ramped up its efforts, setting up long-term surveillance operations. Wiretaps caught snippets of conversations, names, dates, addresses. Informants were working their way into the network. Every time there was violence on the streets, it gave the authorities another excuse to crack down harder. Nicky tried to keep ahead of it all, but even he could feel the pressure building. He had created an empire designed to stay invisible, but now it was becoming harder and harder to hide. The money was too big, the headlines too loud, the product too widespread. There was no corner of Harlem untouched by the heroin trade, and no corner where the police weren't looking for him. At night, when the clubs were quiet and the phone stopped ringing, Nicky must have known, somewhere deep inside, that things couldn't stay this way forever. Empires rarely die in one sudden blow, they begin to crumble slowly, piece by piece. Trust begins to fray. Allies begin to drift. The very foundation that once seemed so solid begins to shift underfoot. But to the outside world, nothing had changed. Mr. Untouchable was still on top. The cars still gleamed. The suits were still perfect. The parties were still lavish. He still moved through Harlem like a man completely in command. And perhaps, in some way, he still believed he was. The truth, however, was that Harlem itself was changing. The streets were no longer just the playground they had been when he was younger. They were battlefields now, quiet and deadly, filled with people who were either feeding on the drug trade or being devoured by it. The cost of doing business had grown heavier, not just in dollars but in lives. And then came the whispers, rumors of discontent inside the council, talk of betrayal, talk of disrespect. Nicky had built the council to keep the streets united, but even the most carefully built alliances can crack when the pressure gets too high. Some members were reportedly sleeping with women who had once been loyal to Nicky. Others were accused of skimming profits. These were not just business issues, they were personal slights, insults to a man who prided himself on respect and loyalty. Nicky was still calm, still outwardly collected, but inside, the temperature was rising. He could forgive mistakes, but betrayal was another matter. And betrayal, once it enters an organization, is like a slow poison, it spreads. For now, though, he kept his composure. There were still deals to be made, money to be counted, and a reputation to maintain. Mr. Untouchable could not afford to show cracks, not to his enemies and not to his friends. He would deal with disloyalty when the time was right. But the Harlem that once seemed like his kingdom was beginning to turn on him. The police were coming closer. The community was losing patience. The violence was escalating. And somewhere, out of sight, the first pieces of the case that would one day bring him down were quietly falling into place. By the late 1970s, the walls around Nicky Barnes were no longer invisible. They were closing in, one deliberate brick at a time, built by agents who had turned their pursuit of him into a personal mission. The DEA, the FBI, the NYPD, they were no longer working in separate silos. They had joined forces, sharing information, coordinating raids, running surveillance that never seemed to end. The man they called Mr. Untouchable had become their most prized target. Inside federal offices, Nicky's name was circled on boards, connected by lines to lieutenants, stash houses, and suspected suppliers. Agents spent hours listening to wiretaps, flipping through photographs, charting the movements of his associates. Some of them had been on his trail for years, and with every failed prosecution, their determination only deepened. They knew his habits now. They knew what time he left his house, what clubs he frequented, even what route he preferred to take when driving through Harlem. They followed him relentlessly, documenting everything. Sometimes, he seemed to toy with them, waving at surveillance cars, smiling as if to remind them that no matter how closely they watched, they still couldn't touch him. But behind the scenes, the case against him was growing stronger. Informants, once terrified to speak his name, began to cooperate. Some did it for money, others for protection, and some simply because the pressure became too much. Each new piece of information was added to the puzzle: dates, times, shipments, meetings. The picture of Nicky's empire was becoming clearer. Wiretaps caught voices discussing deals, using coded language that agents painstakingly deciphered. Surveillance teams documented cash exchanges, suspicious meetings, and the comings and goings at suspected stash houses. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial anymore, it was becoming concrete. And yet, Nicky remained calm. He had been here before, had faced investigations and walked away untouched. His lawyers were some of the best money could buy. He understood the system, knew the weaknesses in cases, and trusted that he could beat this one too. But this time was different. This time, the government was patient. Instead of rushing to arrest him, they built a case designed to withstand every legal challenge, every technicality. They wanted to hit him so hard that there would be no way out, no way to laugh it off in a magazine interview or walk free after a mistrial. The pressure around him grew more intense with each passing month. Associates were being picked up, questioned, squeezed for information. Some of them disappeared into witness protection, leaving Nicky to wonder who had talked and what they had said. The council, once united, began to feel the strain. Meetings grew more tense, voices sharper. Trust, once the backbone of the organization, was beginning to fray. Then came the day it all came crashing down. It began like any other day, with Nicky moving through his routine, calm, deliberate, confident. But when the agents finally moved in, there was no warning. Federal officers swept in with precision, their timing carefully chosen, their warrant ready. They surrounded him, their presence unmistakable. For the first time in years, Mr. Untouchable was in custody. The moment must have been surreal, the click of handcuffs, the flash of cameras, the quiet murmur of onlookers as Harlem's most powerful man was led away. And yet, true to form, Nicky stayed composed. There was no shouting, no fighting, no desperate attempt to run. He walked with his head held high, as though this was just another move in a long game he still believed he could win. News of his arrest spread quickly. The man who had grinned on the cover of the New York Times magazine was now splashed across headlines again, but this time the tone was different. Reporters described the massive operation it had taken to bring him in, the years of work that had gone into building the case. To the public, it was the beginning of the end of an era. Inside holding cells and courtrooms, Nicky maintained his composure. He consulted with his lawyers, listened carefully, and never showed fear. To his followers, it was proof that he was still in control. To prosecutors, it was proof that he remained as defiant as ever, and it only made them more determined to see him convicted. The case against him was strong, built on months of surveillance, testimony from insiders, and a trail of evidence that seemed impossible to escape. The government was not just looking to arrest Nicky Barnes, they wanted to dismantle everything he had built, to take apart the council piece by piece, to send a message to every dealer in Harlem that no one, not even Mr. Untouchable, was beyond their reach. Nicky, however, still believed in his own myth. He had beaten cases before. He had seen evidence fall apart under cross-examination, had watched juries hesitate to convict. To him, this was just another challenge. Another round in a fight he had been winning for years. But as he sat in his cell that night, listening to the distant echoes of the jail around him, he must have felt something different this time, a small but undeniable shift. The empire he had built with such precision was no longer under his complete control. Decisions were being made without him. Associates were whispering behind closed doors. And outside those walls, the government was preparing to make an example of him. For now, though, Nicky waited, calm and unreadable. The trial was coming, and he was ready to fight. In his mind, the story of Mr. Untouchable was far from over. But what Nicky did not yet know was that this arrest was the turning point, the moment that would set into motion a chain of events that even he could not stop. The courtroom was hushed the morning Nicky Barnes was led in for the first day of his trial. Reporters filled the benches, their pens ready, their cameras waiting outside for even the smallest glimpse of Harlem's most notorious man. Spectators craned their necks, hoping to see the man they had read about, the man whose face had once smiled from the cover of the New York Times magazine. And there he was, walking in with that same calm, measured stride, dressed immaculately in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable. If there was fear in him, he didn't show it. He nodded to his lawyers, sat down quietly, and folded his hands in front of him as though he were merely attending a business meeting. The prosecutors wasted no time. From the very beginning, they painted Nicky as the mastermind behind one of the largest heroin distribution networks in the country. Charts were displayed showing the flow of product from suppliers to dealers, photographs of stash houses projected on the wall, stacks of ledgers introduced as evidence. Each witness they called was another thread, carefully woven into the tapestry of the government's case. There were former associates who had cut deals, men who had once been loyal but now sat on the stand pointing in Nicky's direction. Some spoke quietly, nervously, their eyes darting toward the defense table as if expecting retribution even from across the room. Others testified with open resentment, eager to settle old scores or save themselves from lengthy sentences. Nicky listened to them all, his face calm, his body still. Occasionally, he would lean toward his attorney and whisper something, or glance at the evidence being shown, but he never erupted, never lost control. To the jury, it was a striking contrast, the government portraying him as a ruthless kingpin, while he sat there looking like a corporate executive attending a shareholders' meeting. But the testimony was relentless. Witness after witness described the structure of the council, the way profits were divided, the rules that were enforced, and the shipments that kept Harlem supplied. Wiretap recordings were played, muffled voices decoded by agents, their transcripts handed to the jurors. Surveillance photos showed Nicky entering meetings, shaking hands with other council members, and leaving locations the government identified as drug stash houses. The defense fought back hard. Nicky's lawyers challenged the credibility of every witness, pointing out their deals with the prosecution, suggesting that they were lying to save themselves. They questioned the chain of custody on evidence, filed motions to exclude certain tapes, argued over every technicality they could find. And for a while, it seemed as though Nicky might just slip through their fingers once again. But this case was different. This time, the prosecution had spent years building a case too solid to be shaken. They anticipated the legal challenges and had prepared meticulously. Each time the defense tried to create doubt, the government returned with another piece of evidence, another witness, another piece of the puzzle. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day drawing more attention from the press. Outside the courthouse, Harlem residents gathered, some showing support, others hoping for justice. Inside, the tension was so thick it was almost tangible. And through it all, Nicky never wavered. His composure became its own kind of spectacle. The jurors watched him carefully, perhaps wondering what kind of man could sit so calmly while his empire was dismantled in front of him. Then came the closing arguments. The prosecution stood before the jury and told them that this was their chance to send a message, that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. They reminded the jurors of the photographs, the recordings, the testimony that had laid out in detail the operations of the council. The defense urged the jury not to be swayed by Nicky's reputation, arguing that the government had built its case on the words of criminals who had every reason to lie. They tried to plant seeds of reasonable doubt, to remind the jurors that untouchable didn't mean guilty. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. Hours passed. Then a day. And another. Nicky waited, patient as ever, his face revealing nothing. Finally, the jury returned. The room grew still as the foreman stood. One by one, the charges were read. Guilty. 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 The words echoed through the room like the closing of a door. For years, Nicky Barnes had lived up to his nickname, slipping through the fingers of law enforcement time and time again. But this time, the system had caught him. And yet, even in that moment, he did not break. He did not cry out or protest. He sat silently, his jaw set, his gaze steady. If he felt anger or fear, he kept it buried where no one could see it. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed to file their stories. The headlines that evening announced it to the world: Mr. Untouchable had finally been touched. For Harlem, the news was bittersweet. Some celebrated, believing that justice had finally been served. Others mourned, feeling that a symbol of defiance against a rigged system had been taken down. But whether they cheered or cursed his name, everyone knew it was the end of an era. For Nicky, it was not just a conviction. It was a sentence to life behind bars. The empire he had built so carefully was now at the mercy of others, and the man who had once been in total control was now at the mercy of the prison system he had once outsmarted. As he was led away, still calm, still composed, the question lingered, what would become of Mr. Untouchable now that he was no longer free? Prison looked different this time. Before, it had been a temporary stop, a place to learn, to wait, to sharpen his mind before stepping back out into the world. But now, the gates closed behind him with a different sound, not just the sound of metal on metal, but the sound of finality. This was no short stint. This was life. Nicky Barnes walked into the facility with his head high, as always. If he felt fear, he refused to show it. The other inmates watched him carefully. Everyone knew who he was. His reputation had preceded him, the man who had run Harlem, the man the government called the biggest heroin dealer in America. Some greeted him with respect. Others with envy. And some, quietly, with resentment. The first days were a test. The routines were familiar, but the weight of a life sentence was not. Each clang of the cell door, each count by the guards, each sound of keys rattling in the hallway reminded him that he would be hearing those sounds not for months or years, but for the rest of his life. It was a sobering thought, even for a man as disciplined as Nicky. Still, he did what he had always done, he adapted. He kept himself sharp. He worked out daily, maintained his appearance, and kept a strict schedule. Discipline had gotten him this far, and it would carry him now. He was determined not to let prison break him. He also began to rebuild his network from inside. He sent messages through lawyers, through trusted friends, through coded letters. He tried to maintain control of the council, to keep the business running smoothly even though he was no longer on the outside. For a time, it seemed to work. Money still flowed. The operation still functioned. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. Decisions were being made without him. Corners were being cut. Rules he had put in place were ignored. Some of his lieutenants began fighting among themselves. There were whispers of disloyalty, of men taking more than their share, of others plotting to take over entirely. The worst blow came when word reached Nicky that some of his closest associates were not just undermining him in business, but betraying him personally. Men he had trusted, men he had brought into the council, were reportedly sleeping with the women who had once been loyal to him. To Nicky, this wasn't just business, it was a deep, personal insult. Respect had always been the cornerstone of his world. Without respect, everything else crumbled. The news ate at him. Day after day, he sat in his cell, thinking about the life he had built and the men who were now dismantling it piece by piece. He had created the council to bring order to Harlem, to eliminate the chaos of the streets, but now, from behind bars, he watched that order dissolve. He tried to regain control. Messages were sent, orders given, but it was never the same. He was no longer there to enforce his rules personally, to look men in the eye and demand accountability. Distance had turned him from a feared leader into a man whose words could be ignored. Prison life was wearing on him in other ways too. He missed the freedom of movement, the ability to drive through Harlem at night, to walk into a club and feel every eye turned toward him. Now, his world was measured in concrete walls and narrow hallways. The man who had once controlled millions of dollars in cash now stood in line for his meals like everyone else. But even in these moments, Nicky refused to let go of his identity. He still carried himself like a man in charge. Other inmates noticed the way he walked, the way he spoke, the way he never allowed himself to look defeated. There was still a quiet power about him. And yet, inside, something was changing. The discipline was still there, but there was anger now too, cold, simmering anger. Anger at the government for putting him there. Anger at the men who had betrayed him. Anger at himself for trusting them. Nights were the hardest. When the noise of the prison finally died down and the lights went out, Nicky would lie awake, thinking of Harlem, of the life he once had, of the empire he had built. He thought of the rules he had put in place, the order he had created, and how quickly it had all unraveled without him. Prison had once been his university, a place where he learned to rise. Now it was his cage, a place where he was forced to watch his kingdom fall apart one piece at a time. And then came the moment that would change everything. It was a decision that would shock the underworld, a decision no one ever expected Nicky Barnes to make. He had spent his entire life building an empire, demanding loyalty, punishing betrayal. Now, faced with a life behind bars and a council that had turned its back on him, he began to consider doing the one thing he had always sworn he would never do. Cooperation. The idea must have felt like swallowing glass at first. To cooperate with the government, to testify against the council, it was unthinkable. And yet, as the months turned to years, as the betrayals piled up, as the letters came back with more bad news, the unthinkable began to seem inevitable. The man who had once been untouchable was about to make a decision that would touch everyone around him, a decision that would burn down everything he had built and take nearly everyone who had betrayed him down with it. For years, Nicky Barnes had lived by a simple code, loyalty above all else. It was what separated him from the reckless hustlers, what allowed him to build the council, what made him believe that he could control an empire without it collapsing under its own weight. Loyalty had been his compass, and now, sitting behind bars, that compass was spinning wildly, pointing nowhere. The news kept coming, each report more bitter than the last. From his cell, Nicky heard about council members running the operation poorly, cutting deals that risked exposure, skimming profits, letting the organization slip into chaos. Worse, the personal betrayals hit harder than any business failure ever could. Trusted allies had taken liberties he considered unforgivable, sleeping with women who had once been his, disrespecting his name, treating his absence as an opportunity to seize more power for themselves. For a man like Nicky, this wasn't just an insult. It was a deep wound to his pride, his identity. He had built the council on the principle of mutual respect, and now that respect was gone. They hadn't just disobeyed him, they had humiliated him. And humiliation was something Nicky Barnes had never tolerated. The days in prison grew longer. Nights stretched endlessly, each one filled with thoughts that turned darker as time went on. He replayed every decision, every conversation, every handshake that had brought him to this point. He thought of the men he had trusted most, the ones who were supposed to hold the line in his absence, and he felt the anger build like a slow fire. At first, he considered other options. He tried to send messages, to reassert his authority, to remind the remaining members of the council that he was still the man who had built everything they were now enjoying. But the responses were weak, dismissive. He could feel the power slipping away, feel himself being forgotten. And so, the idea that had once seemed impossible began to take root. If they had turned their backs on him, why should he protect them? If they no longer respected his code, why should he keep living by it? For a man like Nicky, this was no simple decision. Cooperating with the government was the ultimate betrayal in the world he had ruled. It was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. He knew what it meant, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever stood with him. But as he sat there, staring at the cinderblock walls of his cell, he came to a conclusion that would define the rest of his life. If they had betrayed him first, then they had already broken the code. The decision was not impulsive. Nicky approached it with the same discipline he had brought to every move he ever made. He weighed the risks carefully, thought about the consequences, considered what he stood to lose, and what he stood to gain. Revenge was part of it, yes, but there was also practicality. His sentence was life without parole. Cooperation could change that. It could give him a chance, however slim, at freedom. And so, Nicky called for a meeting with federal authorities. It was done quietly, cautiously. The first conversations were tentative, testing the waters, seeing if the government was willing to deal. They were. To them, this was a dream come true, the man they had spent years trying to bring down was now offering to help them dismantle the very organization he had created. The negotiations were careful. Nicky wanted assurances, protection, a reduction in sentence, a chance to start over under a new identity. The government wanted everything he knew: names, addresses, details of every shipment, every meeting, every stash house. They wanted the council. And Nicky gave it to them. One by one, he laid out the structure of his empire. He named names, men who had once sat across the table from him, who had trusted him with their lives. He gave investigators the map they needed to take down what was left of the council. Every piece of information was like a match dropped onto dry wood, igniting cases that had been cold for years. The process was methodical, almost clinical. Nicky didn't rant or rave. He didn't gloat. He simply delivered facts, one after another, as though he were conducting business, which, in a way, he was. But beneath the calm surface, there was something else driving him: the need to settle the score. The men who had betrayed him would pay, and Nicky would be the one to collect. The decision sent shockwaves through Harlem's underworld. Word spread quickly that Mr. Untouchable had flipped, that he was now working with the very government he had spent years outsmarting. For some, it was unthinkable. For others, it was inevitable, the final act in a story that had been leading to this moment all along. In his cell, Nicky felt a strange sense of clarity. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The man who had once been Harlem's most feared kingpin was now something entirely different, the government's most valuable witness. And yet, there must have been nights when he lay awake and thought about what it meant. Cooperating had cost him the last shred of his old life. He could never go back to Harlem, never sit in a club surrounded by his crew, never walk through the streets with that same air of untouchability. He had traded one kind of power for another, the power to destroy everything he had once built. But perhaps, in some way, that was enough. Perhaps watching the council fall, watching the men who had betrayed him led away in handcuffs, was its own kind of victory. The decision had been made. The path was set. And soon, Nicky Barnes would step into the courtroom, not as the defendant this time, but as the star witness. The day Nicky Barnes took the witness stand, the courtroom was charged with a different kind of energy. It wasn't just another day of testimony, everyone in that room knew they were about to witness history. The man who had built Harlem's most powerful heroin syndicate, who had been the face of defiance against law enforcement, was now about to help the very system he once outsmarted destroy everything he had created. When he entered, the room fell silent. Nicky was dressed in a simple suit, his posture straight, his expression as calm as ever. If there was tension in him, he didn't let it show. He walked to the stand with the same slow, measured steps that had once carried him through Harlem's nightclubs, and he raised his hand to take the oath without hesitation. The prosecutors began carefully, building the foundation of their case. They asked about the council, how it had been formed, who its members were, what its purpose had been. Nicky answered in a steady, almost clinical tone. There was no anger in his voice, no sign of regret, just precision. He spoke like a man recounting the details of a business he had once run, which, in a way, he was. One by one, he named the men who had once been his closest allies. He explained their roles, their territories, the profits they earned, the rules they broke. Each name he spoke was like a hammer strike, echoing through the room, landing with devastating weight. Some of the defendants wouldn't even look at him. Others stared at him with cold fury, their jaws clenched. For the jurors, it was a rare glimpse inside an empire that had long been shrouded in secrecy. Nicky described the meetings, the coded language, the way shipments moved through Harlem with military-like precision. He detailed the profits, millions of dollars a week at the height of the operation, and explained how those profits were divided, laundered, and reinvested. At times, it must have felt surreal to everyone in the room. Here was the man they had called Mr. Untouchable, the man who had once been the subject of headlines celebrating his ability to evade justice, now calmly dismantling his own legend piece by piece. The prosecutors guided him through it all, the betrayals that had pushed him to this point, the breakdown of the council's discipline, the disrespect that had finally broken the code he had lived by. Nicky didn't lash out, didn't raise his voice. If anything, his calm made the testimony even more powerful. Outside the courthouse, Harlem buzzed with rumors. Some were stunned that Nicky had flipped. Others saw it as inevitable, the natural conclusion of a story that had always been about survival. For many, it was a bitter pill. In the code of the streets, cooperating with the government was the ultimate sin. But for others, there was a grim satisfaction in seeing the entire machine exposed for what it was. Day after day, Nicky returned to the stand, offering more details, connecting more dots, leaving less and less room for the defense to maneuver. The prosecutors used his testimony to tie together years of surveillance, dozens of witnesses, mountains of evidence. It was as though Nicky had handed them the master key to unlock every door. The defense attorneys tried to discredit him, calling him a liar, a man motivated by revenge, a man willing to say anything to save himself. They cross-examined him aggressively, asking if he felt shame, if he feared retribution, if he understood what he was doing to the men who had once trusted him. Nicky never flinched. He answered calmly, directly. If the questions rattled him, he didn't let it show. To the jury, it was compelling, a man who seemed completely in control, even as he burned down his own house. And burn it down he did. One by one, the dominoes began to fall. Indictments were handed down. Convictions followed. Men who had once walked the streets of Harlem with the same confidence Nicky once had were now led away in chains. The council, the organization that had once brought order to the chaos of the heroin trade, was finished. For Nicky, it was a strange kind of victory. From his cell, he heard about the sentences, the convictions, the collapse of the empire he had built. He had destroyed the very thing he once fought so hard to protect, and yet, in doing so, he had satisfied something deep within himself. The men who had betrayed him were paying the ultimate price. But the victory came with a cost. In Harlem, the streets no longer spoke his name with admiration. For many, he was no longer Mr. Untouchable, he was a rat, a traitor. The myth he had built for years was crumbling, replaced by a new story, the story of the king who had turned against his own kingdom. And yet, in the quiet of his prison cell, Nicky seemed to accept it. He had always been a man who valued discipline, control, and order. The council had broken that order, and he had restored it in the only way he could. If that meant burning everything to the ground, so be it. When his testimony was finished, the courtroom felt different. There was a strange stillness, as though everyone knew they had just witnessed the end of something, not just a case, but an era. The Harlem heroin empire, at least the one Nicky had built, was gone. But Nicky's story was not over. With his cooperation complete, he faced a new chapter, one that would take him far from Harlem, far from the streets where his name had once been legend. He had traded one identity for another, one life for another. The man who had once been untouchable was about to vanish, not into prison, but into an entirely new existence. When the last gavel fell and the final verdicts were read, Nicky Barnes was no longer just a convicted man, he was something entirely different. He was now a government witness, an asset who had delivered the fall of Harlem's most powerful drug syndicate. And for that, he was rewarded not with freedom, not with a return to the streets he once ruled, but with something far stranger, a new life, hidden from the world. The process was quiet, almost surgical. Federal marshals took over, removing him from the prison where he had served his sentence until now. His old identity, once so famous, so feared, so celebrated, was stripped away piece by piece. The name, Nicky Barnes, the name that had made headlines, that had been whispered in alleyways, that had become legend, no longer belonged to him. A new name was given. A new background was created. Somewhere, in a small, anonymous office, a file was opened with details about his new life, where he would live, what he would be called, what rules he would have to follow. It was as though he had died and been reborn, not as a kingpin or a celebrity gangster, but as a ghost. Witness protection was both a gift and a prison. On the one hand, it offered safety. Nicky had made enemies, and the men he had testified against, or their associates, would have gladly sought revenge if they could find him. The program kept him hidden, moved him if necessary, ensured that his location remained secret. But on the other hand, it was lonely. For a man who had once commanded rooms, who had walked through Harlem's clubs like a general inspecting his troops, the anonymity was suffocating. There were no more corner meetings, no more nods of respect from passers-by, no more whispered greetings from those who feared or admired him. Now, when he walked into a grocery store, no one looked twice. No one knew who he was. The silence must have been deafening. Harlem, with its constant noise, the music, the cars, the chatter, had been his soundtrack for decades. Now he lived in quiet suburbs, small towns, places where nights ended early and the streets emptied after dark. He had traded chaos for calm, but calm can feel like exile to a man used to being in the center of everything. Still, Nicky adjusted in the only way he knew how, with discipline. He lived quietly, followed the rules of the program, kept to himself. If there were moments of temptation, moments when he considered breaking the rules, reaching out to old friends, making contact with the world he left behind, he kept them under control. But the memories must have stayed with him. Late at night, sitting in an unfamiliar kitchen or lying in bed in some nondescript house, he must have replayed those Harlem nights in his mind, the sound of jazz spilling out of club doors, the sight of cars cruising slowly down Lenox Avenue, the feel of power when he walked into a room and everyone stopped talking. He must have also thought about the people who were no longer there, the men of the council, now scattered through prisons across the country, their voices silenced by the same testimony that had saved him. Perhaps he thought of the women who had betrayed him, of the crew members who had been disloyal, of the enemies who had always wanted to see him fall. In witness protection, there were no crews, no lieutenants, no loyal soldiers to carry out his orders. There was just Nicky, alone with his thoughts, living a life that felt both safe and hollow. The man who had once been the most visible figure in Harlem's underworld had become invisible. Yet there was a strange peace in that invisibility too. For the first time in decades, Nicky did not have to look over his shoulder every second. There were no surveillance cars tailing him, no wiretaps listening to his calls, no rivals plotting against him. The quiet might have been lonely, but it was also free of danger, a different kind of freedom than he had ever known. And over time, the legend of Mr. Untouchable faded. The streets moved on. New players rose, new crews took over corners, new hustlers made names for themselves. Harlem itself began to change, inching toward the gentrification that would one day transform its skyline and its soul. The era of Nicky Barnes became just that, an era, a chapter in the city's long history. Occasionally, stories about him would surface, a mention in a newspaper, a reference in a song, a rumor whispered on the block, but they were only echoes. The man himself was gone, hidden somewhere out of sight, living a life that most of Harlem would never see. For those who had once known him, it must have been a strange thing, to know that Nicky Barnes was still alive, but to never know where. To imagine him standing in some quiet kitchen, sipping coffee, watching the morning news, just another face in the crowd. But Nicky Barnes had always been a man who thrived on control, and in its own way, witness protection gave him a new kind of control, the control to disappear, to decide when and if the world would ever see him again. Still, one can't help but wonder what went through his mind during those long, quiet years. Did he miss the power? The money? The constant hum of Harlem? Or did he find some solace in being just another man, free from the burden of being a legend? Whatever the answer, one thing was certain, the man who had once been untouchable was now untouchable in a different way, hidden not by power or fear, but by anonymity. Even as Nicky Barnes disappeared into anonymity, the myth of Mr. Untouchable only seemed to grow. The streets might have stopped seeing him, but they never stopped talking about him. In Harlem, his name became part of the city's folklore, whispered in barber shops, remembered in stories told by older hustlers to the younger generation. His face, that famous grin from the cover of the New York Times magazine, became an icon, a reminder of a time when one man seemed to hold Harlem in his hands. For some, that image was a cautionary tale, a warning about the price of chasing power. For others, it was inspiration, proof that someone from their streets had once risen so high that even the federal government had to spend years bringing him down. Writers, journalists, and filmmakers were fascinated by him. Books were written about his life, charting his rise and fall, interviewing everyone from law enforcement agents to former associates. True crime documentaries devoted entire episodes to the legend of Mr. Untouchable, often using grainy black and white photos of Harlem in the 1970s, the kind that showed crowded streets, shiny Cadillacs, and the faces of men who looked like kings in their custom suits. Hip-hop, which was growing into a dominant cultural force during the years after Nicky's disappearance, embraced his name as a symbol of outlaw success. Rappers dropped references to him in their lyrics, casting him as a figure of both danger and ambition. In a world where the streets still shaped art, Nicky Barnes was a ready-made archetype, the brilliant strategist, the defiant outlaw, the man who had beaten the system long enough to become a legend. Even Hollywood eventually turned its gaze toward him. Films about Harlem's heroin era used characters modeled after Nicky, their sharp suits and disciplined mannerisms clearly inspired by the real man. Some movies portrayed him as a mastermind, others as a cautionary figure who lost everything. Either way, the image of Nicky Barnes lived on long after the man himself had gone quiet. For Nicky, this strange afterlife of fame must have been surreal. Sitting in witness protection, far from the neighborhoods that once spoke his name, he was now watching the world turn his life into stories, rhymes, and screenplays. Perhaps he read about himself in the papers, or watched a documentary about his own empire on television, hearing his name spoken by narrators who had never met him. In a rare interview years after his disappearance, Nicky himself reflected on the myth that surrounded him. He acknowledged the fascination, the way people seemed drawn to his story, and he admitted that part of him understood it. He had always been careful about his image, had always known that how he was seen was almost as important as what he did. In a way, the myth of Mr. Untouchable was something he had built himself, brick by brick, just as much as he had built his heroin empire. But he also expressed a sense of distance from that myth, as though it belonged to someone else. The man in the suit on that magazine cover, staring into the camera with a defiant grin, was someone he used to be, someone who had been shaped by Harlem, by the streets, by ambition and pride. The man speaking in that interview was older, quieter, reflecting on a life that felt like another lifetime entirely. Pop culture, however, didn't care about the quieter version. It cared about the legend, the outlaw who had made millions, who had outsmarted the law, who had become a symbol of both power and downfall. The legend of Mr. Untouchable became a kind of mirror, reflecting whatever people wanted to see, a genius strategist, a ruthless villain, a tragic anti-hero. For Harlem, the myth carried a bittersweet edge. It was a reminder of an era when the neighborhood was both alive with energy and drowning in heroin. Some old-timers spoke about Nicky with respect, recalling the discipline he demanded, the order he brought. Others spoke with bitterness, remembering the devastation the drug trade had left behind, the addicts, the broken families, the funerals. And so, as the real Nicky lived out his days in anonymity, the myth of Nicky Barnes lived on in a strange kind of immortality. It was as though two men existed, the flesh-and-blood Leroy Barnes, hidden somewhere in America, and the larger-than-life Mr. Untouchable, still walking the streets of Harlem in memory, still appearing in songs, books, and movies. This duality became part of what made his story so compelling. It wasn't just a crime story, it was a story about transformation, about the making and unmaking of a man. The young hustler who had once learned the rules of the game on Harlem's corners had turned himself into a kingpin, then into a witness, then into a ghost. And yet, somehow, he remained a presence in the culture, a name that still had weight decades after he had vanished from sight. Perhaps, in some way, that was exactly what Nicky wanted. To be remembered not just as another criminal, but as a figure who had carved his name into history, who had left a mark that couldn't be erased. Whether admired or hated, celebrated or condemned, Mr. Untouchable had become more than just a man, he had become a legend. And as the years went on, that legend would only grow, as Harlem itself began to change, as new generations heard the story and added their own interpretations. For some, Nicky Barnes was a hero. For others, he was a warning. For all, he was unforgettable. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. By the time Nicky Barnes reached his later years, the man who had once been Harlem's most feared kingpin had grown quieter, more contemplative. The world outside had changed drastically since the 1970s, Harlem was no longer the same Harlem he once ruled. The streets had new names, new faces, new players. The drug trade that had once been so organized under the council had splintered and evolved into something else entirely. And yet, somewhere far from it all, Nicky sat and thought about the life he had lived. In witness protection, there were few opportunities to speak publicly, but every so often, he granted a rare interview. When he did, the world listened. His voice was calm, measured, still carrying that aura of control that had defined him for so long. But there was something different too, a weight in his words, a sense that time had given him perspective. In those interviews, he spoke of discipline, of the way he had run his empire with precision and order. He explained how he had viewed the council not as a gang but as a governing body, a kind of corporation that brought structure to a business that might otherwise have been chaotic. There was pride in his tone when he spoke of the efficiency they had achieved, of the calm they had imposed on the streets. But he also spoke of betrayal, and the pain of watching the men he trusted turn against him. It was clear that those wounds had never fully healed. "I gave them something no one else could," he once said in a recorded interview. "And when I needed them to hold the line, they didn't. They broke the code. So I did what I had to do." There was no apology in those words, no regret for the decision to cooperate with the government. If anything, Nicky seemed to see it as the inevitable conclusion of a story that had already ended when loyalty had been broken. "If they had stayed loyal," he said, "I would have stayed loyal. But they didn't. So the rules changed." Still, there were moments when the mask seemed to slip, moments when he spoke of the people whose lives had been destroyed by heroin, of the damage that had been done to Harlem during those years. He did not cry, did not break down, but he acknowledged the cost. "I didn't put the needle in anyone's arm," he once remarked, "but I know what my product did. I know what it cost the community." It was a rare glimpse into a man who had spent his life controlling every part of his image. For decades, Nicky Barnes had been seen as a symbol of power and defiance, a man who seemed immune to fear or remorse. But in those moments, speaking softly about the past, he sounded less like the man on the magazine cover and more like someone who had finally had time to sit with the weight of his choices. He also spoke of change, not just his own, but the change he saw in Harlem from a distance. Gentrification had reshaped the neighborhood. The clubs where he once held court were gone, replaced by cafes and boutique shops. The brownstones were renovated, the streets cleaner, the music quieter. It was a different world now, one that might not have recognized him even if he had walked through its streets again. Age, too, had humbled him in small ways. The man who had once been feared, who had once commanded millions, was now just another older man living out his days quietly. He still carried himself with dignity, still spoke with authority, but the fire of youth had cooled into something gentler. In the quiet of his later years, Nicky Barnes seemed to turn inward, reflecting not just on the rise and fall of his empire but on the man he had been. Perhaps he wondered what his life might have been if he had chosen a different path, if he had taken his intelligence, his discipline, his leadership skills and used them somewhere else, somewhere legitimate. It was easy to imagine him as a businessman, a politician, a leader of a different kind. But Nicky had never been one to indulge in too much regret. He saw life as a series of choices, and he had made his choices knowing full well the risks. He had paid the price, and he accepted that. In one of his last interviews, he summed it up simply, I did what I did. I made my money, I made my name. And I lost it all. That's the game. There was a kind of peace in that statement, not joy, not pride, but acceptance. The man who had once been called untouchable had finally been touched, had been brought down, had been forced to start over. And yet, he had survived. That, perhaps, was his final victory. As the years wore on, his public appearances became even rarer, until eventually they stopped altogether. The world moved on, and Nicky Barnes faded into the background once more, a ghost watching quietly as time erased the Harlem he once knew. But somewhere, in a small house under a name no one knew, he must have sat sometimes by the window, looking out at the night, remembering the days when Harlem belonged to him, the sound of the music, the glow of the neon lights, the feeling of being young, powerful, and untouchable. Death, like everything else in Nicky Barnes' later life, came quietly. There were no headlines at first, no cameras outside courthouses, no murmurs in Harlem's bars. For years after his disappearance into witness protection, the world had heard almost nothing about him, and then, sometime around 2012, the man once known as Mr. Untouchable slipped away. The details were sparse, as they always are for those in the federal witness protection program. There was no public obituary, no funeral for Harlem to attend. The news did not break until years later, when a reporter uncovered the truth and confirmed what many had wondered for a long time: Nicky Barnes had died of cancer, somewhere in the United States, far from the city he once ruled. He was 78 years old. It was a strange ending for a man who had lived such a loud, public life at his peak. Nicky's story had once been told in flashing headlines and courtroom sketches, in magazine covers and whispered street corner gossip. Now, his final chapter was written in silence, his death almost hidden from the world. Perhaps that was fitting. The man who had once been everywhere, on every corner, in every newspaper, had spent the last decades of his life in the shadows. Death, when it came, found him in those shadows, where only a few knew his name anymore, and fewer still knew where to find him. When the news eventually surfaced, it sent ripples through Harlem and the world of organized crime historians. For many, it felt like the closing of a door on an era that had already been fading for decades. The headlines that followed were quiet, almost respectful: Mr. Untouchable dies in witness protection. Some were shocked to learn he had been alive for so long. Others had assumed he was gone already. But now that it was official, people began to talk again. Old stories resurfaced. Men who had known him, or claimed to have known him, spoke about the way he carried himself, the discipline he demanded, the way he could control a room without raising his voice. For Harlem, the news was complicated. Some still saw him as a symbol of ambition, of rising from nothing to become someone the whole city had to acknowledge. Others still saw him as a figure of destruction, someone whose empire had left deep scars on the community. And some simply saw him as part of Harlem's past, a man whose story was tied to a version of the neighborhood that no longer existed. There is a kind of poetry in the way his life ended. The man who had once been called untouchable had been touched by time, by betrayal, by prison, by the slow weight of years. And yet, in the end, he left the world as quietly as he had entered witness protection: no spectacle, no final show of defiance, just a man closing his eyes for the last time in a place far from home. It is easy to imagine him in those last days, perhaps sitting in a quiet room, looking out a window at a world that had long since moved on. Maybe he thought about Harlem, about Lenox Avenue, about the music that used to spill out of the clubs, about the suits he once wore and the cars he once drove. Maybe he thought about the council, about the men he had once called brothers, about the decisions that had led him to this place of anonymity. Or maybe he thought of nothing at all, choosing instead to leave the past behind entirely, as he had tried to do for so many years in witness protection. His death marked the end of one of the most fascinating criminal stories in American history. It also marked the end of a paradox: a man who had been at once a disciplined businessman and a ruthless kingpin, a folk hero and a villain, a man who was feared, admired, and despised all at once. When the news of his passing reached those who had once known him, the reactions were mixed. Some spoke of him with respect, calling him brilliant, charismatic, a man who could have been anything he wanted if the world had given him a different path. Others dismissed him as a cautionary tale, proof that crime, no matter how organized or disciplined, eventually ends in prison or death. But no one denied that he was unforgettable. In a way, the mystery surrounding his death only added to his legend. No one knew exactly where he had lived, who had been by his side in his final days, or what thoughts he carried with him to the end. In death, as in life, Nicky Barnes remained partly hidden, partly untouchable, a man who would never be fully understood, whose story would always have pieces missing, like a puzzle with one or two key parts forever lost. And so, the man who had once been photographed on the cover of the New York Times magazine, smiling with defiance as the government tried and failed to bring him down, was now gone, quietly, without fanfare, leaving behind a shadow that still stretches across Harlem's memory. The streets that once whispered his name have changed. The cars are different, the music is different, the faces are different. But every so often, when someone tells the story of the heroin era, of the council, of the man who once ran Harlem like a corporation, Nicky Barnes' name comes up again. And for a moment, it feels as though he is still there, still walking through the neighborhood in a sharp suit, still untouchable. Harlem did not stand still after Nicky Barnes disappeared into witness protection. The neighborhood that had once been his kingdom kept moving, kept changing, kept reinventing itself as New York City always does. The heroin era that had fueled his empire slowly burned out, leaving behind scars, empty buildings, lost lives, families that would never fully recover. But it also left behind stories, and Harlem is a place that never forgets its stories. In the years that followed Nicky's downfall, the streets were not as tightly controlled. The council was gone, and with it went the discipline that had, for a time, kept the violence in check. Smaller crews tried to fill the vacuum, and for a while, chaos returned. Shootings went up, turf wars reignited, and the stability Nicky had once enforced vanished. Harlem's nights grew louder, more dangerous, and less predictable. But as the 1980s turned into the 1990s, the city began to change. The crack epidemic brought a new wave of destruction, one that made even the heroin years look tame by comparison. Harlem once again found itself in crisis, crime rates soared, abandoned buildings multiplied, and entire blocks fell into disrepair. The memory of the council and Mr. Untouchable became something almost nostalgic for some, a reminder of a time when, despite everything, there had been order. And then, slowly, came another transformation. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Harlem began to gentrify. Developers saw opportunity in the historic brownstones, in the once abandoned storefronts, in the proximity to downtown Manhattan. Coffee shops opened where old bars once stood. Restaurants and jazz lounges began to attract a new crowd, a mix of longtime residents and newcomers drawn by Harlem's culture and history. The streets that had once been battlefields were now lined with renovated apartments and boutique shops. Property values rose. Families who had been there for generations watched as the neighborhood around them changed almost overnight. Some welcomed the new life, the investment, the cleaner streets. Others felt displaced, feeling as though the Harlem they knew was slipping away. Through it all, the memory of the heroin era remained, a quiet ghost in the background. The old head sitting on the stoops would sometimes talk about those days, telling the younger generation about the council, about how the corners used to be run, about how one man in a suit could bring order to chaos. The name Nicky Barnes still carried weight, even if most of the kids had only heard it in passing, maybe in a rap lyric or in a story told by someone who remembered. Murals and street art occasionally appeared, some celebrating Harlem's past, some mourning the lives lost to drugs and violence. In some of them, Nicky's image appeared, not always as a hero, not always as a villain, but as a symbol of a time when Harlem was both thriving and bleeding. Even the city itself seemed to hold echoes of him. The blocks he once controlled were now quieter, but if you walked them late at night, you could almost imagine the rumble of Cadillacs, the low conversations on corners, the smell of the city in the 1970s. Harlem had changed, but its soul had not been erased. And for those who had lived through it, the story of Nicky Barnes remained a complicated one. Some remembered him as a necessary evil, a man who at least brought some order to the drug trade, who kept violence down when others might have let it spiral. Others remembered him as the source of Harlem's pain, the man who got rich while the neighborhood suffered. But everyone agreed on one thing: he was unforgettable. The younger generation, curious about the past, began to rediscover his story through documentaries and books. They learned about the council, about the cover of the New York Times Magazine, about the trials and the betrayals. For some, it was like hearing a myth, a story about a man who once ruled the streets, who fell, and who vanished into the shadows. Harlem itself kept changing. By the 2010s, the transformation was nearly complete. New condominiums stood where old tenements had once been. Trendy restaurants lined streets that had once been dangerous to walk after dark. The Apollo still stood, a reminder of Harlem's golden age, but much of the neighborhood's grit had been polished away. And yet, no amount of development could erase the memory of what had come before. The story of Mr. Untouchable remained part of Harlem's DNA, a cautionary tale, a piece of folklore, a reminder that power can rise and fall in the blink of an eye. For those who remembered the 1970s, walking through the new Harlem could feel strange. The ghosts of the past seemed to hover over every corner, whispering about the days when the council met in secret, when money changed hands in back rooms, when the streets were under a single man's control. Perhaps that is Harlem's greatest strength, its ability to hold all of these layers at once. To be a place of pain and beauty, of music and crime, of tragedy and triumph. Nicky Barnes' story is just one of those layers, but it is a layer that still matters, still shapes the way people talk about the neighborhood, still lingers in the imagination of anyone who walks those streets and wonders what they have seen. And somewhere in the mix of new faces and new buildings, you can still feel it, the hum of history, the memory of a man who once walked here and changed everything. In the end, the story of Leroy Nicky Barnes is not just a story about crime. It is not just about drugs, money, or even power. It is a story about transformation, the transformation of a boy from Harlem into a man who built an empire, the transformation of a neighborhood under his watch, and the transformation of a myth into something larger than life. When we look back at Nicky's life, we see all the contrasts. We see the boy who grew up surrounded by poverty and the man who rose to sit atop Harlem's heroin trade. We see the disciplined mastermind who created the council, a system designed to bring order, and the same man who, years later, dismantled that very system from the witness stand. We see the public figure who once smiled defiantly on the cover of the New York Times Magazine and the private man who lived out his last years in anonymity, hidden from the world he once ruled. His life is a meditation on the cost of ambition. Nicky was brilliant, strategic, disciplined, qualities that, in another life, might have made him a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, a respected community leader, or a politician. Instead, those qualities were channeled into the underworld, where the rewards came fast but carried a price that was always waiting to be collected. For a time, he seemed unstoppable. The money flowed, the streets were quiet under his control, and every attempt to bring him down failed. He became a symbol, Mr. Untouchable, the man who had beaten the system. But the higher he climbed, the more inevitable the fall became. Because no one stays untouchable forever. Not in Harlem. Not anywhere. The story of Nicky Barnes is also a story about loyalty and betrayal. The council was built on trust, and when that trust was broken, everything else fell apart. Nicky's decision to cooperate with the government was shocking, but it was also, in his mind, justified. Those who had betrayed him first had broken the very code that kept them together, and he responded in kind. This raises the question that lingers long after the story is done: was Nicky's downfall the result of his enemies, or of the choices he and his allies made? Was it the government's persistence that finally brought him down, or was it the fractures within his own empire? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it always is. And then there is Harlem itself, the stage on which this story played out. Harlem shaped Nicky, and Nicky shaped Harlem. He imposed order when the streets were chaotic, and when he was gone, the streets descended back into chaos before transforming once again into something new. His era may be over, but his impact remains part of the neighborhood story, one of the many layers that make Harlem what it is today. There is also a quieter, more personal lesson in his life, a lesson about control. Nicky believed in control above all else, control over his business, control over his crew, control over himself. For many years, that control gave him everything he wanted. But in the end, it was something he could not fully hold on to. The betrayals, the arrests, the life sentence, these were reminders that even the most disciplined man cannot control everything. And yet, despite everything, there is still something undeniably compelling about Nicky Barnes. We are drawn to stories like his not because of the drugs or the money, but because of what they tell us about ambition, power, and the human desire to rise above the circumstances we are born into. Nicky's story is a story about someone who refused to accept the limits the world tried to put on him, and who paid dearly for that refusal. As we close this chapter, we are left with an image, Nicky Barnes, years after his rise and fall, sitting in some quiet house under a name no one knows, looking out the window at a world that has long since moved on. Maybe he is remembering the nights when Harlem belonged to him, when the streets seemed to bend to his will. Or maybe he is simply sitting in peace, letting the past stay in the past. His death closed the book on his life, but not on his legend. Mr. Untouchable remains a name that still echoes, in books, in music, in documentaries, in the memories of those who lived through those years. For some, he is a symbol of defiance. For others, a warning about the dangers of pride and power. And so, as the story ends, we are left with questions. What would have happened if Nicky had chosen a different path? Could he have been a force for good, a leader in business or politics, someone who used his intelligence and discipline to build rather than destroy? Or was this always the road he was meant to walk, the road that led from Harlem's corners to the witness stand, to a quiet death far from the place he once ruled? There are no easy answers. That is what makes his story timeless. It is a story about choices, about ambition, about the price of being untouchable. And now, as we let the story settle in our minds, we are left with the sound of Harlem at night, the hum of the streets, the echo of music, the distant memory of a man in a sharp suit stepping out of a shiny car, the man everyone once watched, admired, feared. The man who believed he could never be touched. The streets have changed. The players have changed. The city has moved on. But the legend remains, drifting like smoke above the rooftops of Harlem, reminding us that every empire rises, and every empire falls. And with that thought, the story of Mr. Untouchable comes to an end, leaving us not with a shout, but with a whisper, like the last notes of a song fading into the night.